The first streaks of dawn painted the English Channel a ghostly gray as Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder peered through the salt-crusted window of his landing craft. It was June 6, 1944, and the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance of the next few hours. Behind him, 125 Rangers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion gripped their weapons with white knuckles, their faces etched with the gravity of their mission. They were heading straight into what many believed would be certain death. The night before, General Dwight David Eisenhower had made the most consequential decision of the war, despite Weatherman Group Captain James Martin Stagg's warnings of deteriorating conditions. The Supreme Allied Commander had uttered the words that would echo through history, "Okay, let's go." Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in military history, was about to commence. As Rudder's craft approached the base of Point du Hoc, the sheer limestone cliffs loomed like an impenetrable fortress. German artillery positions atop these 100-foot cliffs commanded a devastating view of both Omaha and Utah beaches. The Rangers' mission was nothing short of impossible: scale these vertical walls under enemy fire and silence the guns that could doom the entire invasion. The first artillery shells began falling around them as they reached the rocky shore. Machine gun fire from concealed positions raked the water, sending geysers of foam and steel fragments into the air. Rudder watched as several of his men fell before they even reached the cliff base. The specially designed UKW amphibious vehicles carrying their scaling equipment had been swamped in the rough seas, leaving the Rangers with makeshift rope ladders and grappling hooks. According to accounts preserved in the National Archives, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Rangers faced not only German resistance, but also the cruel indifference of nature itself. Sergeant First Class Leonard Lomel, a coal miner from New Jersey, was among the first to reach the cliff face. His callous hands found purchase on the slippery limestone as German grenades exploded around him. "Keep climbing," he shouted over the din of battle, his voice barely audible above the thunderous artillery barrage from German positions above. The Rangers had trained for months on similar cliffs along the English coast, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. Each rope they threw up was cut by German defenders. Each ladder they erected was pushed away by long poles. Men fell screaming into the churning waters below, their bodies disappearing beneath the white caps. Yet something extraordinary began to happen. Despite facing overwhelming odds, despite watching their comrades fall around them, the Rangers continued their vertical assault. They improvised, using bayonets as pitons, tearing their hands raw on the sharp rock face, refusing to acknowledge the impossibility of their task. As the first Rangers crested the cliff top, they discovered something that would change the course of the battle. The massive artillery pieces they had risked everything to destroy were not there. Instead, they found wooden decoys and telephone poles, an elaborate deception that had fooled Allied intelligence for months. The real guns had been moved inland, but this knowledge would prove crucial in the hours to come. The sun climbed higher over the Normandy coast as Rudder established his command post in a shell crater atop Point du Hoc. Of the 225 Rangers who had begun the assault, fewer than 90 remained combat effective, but they had accomplished the impossible, and their actions would soon prove instrumental in securing the foothold that would lead to the liberation of Europe. 5 miles to the east, the first wave of American forces was approaching Omaha Beach, and Captain John Robert Slaughter of the 29th Infantry Division could taste the metallic fear in his mouth. The 19-year-old from Roanoke, Virginia, crouched in the bow of his Higgins boat as it pitched violently in the 6-foot swells. Around him, 35 other soldiers fought seasickness and terror in equal measure. The naval bombardment that was supposed to devastate German defenses had largely missed its targets. Bomber crews, flying blind through thick cloud cover, had dropped their payloads to far inland to avoid hitting their own forces. As a result, the Wehrmacht's Atlantic Wall remained largely intact, its guns trained on the narrow strip of sand that American planners had designated as Easy Red Sector. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, the bow ramp of Slaughter's landing craft dropped with a metallic clang. What greeted the Americans was not the softened beachhead they had expected, but a killing field carefully prepared by German engineers, under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Machine gun positions, concealed in the bluffs overlooking the beach, opened fire immediately. The first men out of the boats were cut down before they could take 3 steps. Slaughter watched in horror as Sergeant Thomas Howie, a schoolteacher from Bedford, Virginia, fell face first into the surf, his blood mixing with the cold channel water. The soldiers behind him hesitated for a fatal moment, bunching up in the boat's opening, making themselves perfect targets for the German gunners above. "Move, move, move," screamed Slaughter, pushing his men into the water. But the channel was deeper than expected, and many soldiers, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment, disappeared beneath the waves. Those who made it to the beach found themselves trapped in a nightmare of cross-machine gun fire, mortar explosions, and artillery shells that turned the sand into a moonscape of craters and carnage. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, a 19-year-old from New York, later described the scene in his memoir, as cited in historian Cornelius Ryan's definitive account, The Longest Day, noting how the water turned red with blood and the air filled with the screams of wounded men calling for their mothers. By 7 o'clock, the assault on Omaha Beach was on the verge of complete failure. Dead and wounded Americans littered the shoreline, while the survivors huddled behind the meager protection of beach obstacles and the bodies of their fallen comrades. German artillery observers, positioned in concrete bunkers along the bluff, called down increasingly accurate fire on the stalled invasion force. Colonel George Arthur Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment crawled from group to group of pinned-down soldiers, his uniform torn and bloodied. "There are two kinds of people staying on this beach," he bellowed over the gunfire. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His words, shouted above the cacophony of battle, began to galvanize the scattered units. It was then that individual acts of heroism began to turn the tide. Sergeant Philip Strechek and Private First Class Richard Gallagher spotted a German machine gun nest that had been decimating their company. Without orders, they began a flanking movement up the steep bluff, using hand grenades and rifle fire to silence the position. Their success inspired others to follow. Technical Sergeant William Garwood Peterson, a demolitions expert, realized that the beach exits were blocked by massive concrete barriers. Under heavy fire, he and his team began placing explosive charges, clearing paths through the obstacles that would allow follow-up forces to advance inland. Each explosion was a victory against impossible odds. As the morning progressed, small groups of Americans began to infiltrate the German positions atop the bluff. They moved in short rushes, using craters and debris for cover, slowly but inexorably pushing inland. The German defenders, many of them young conscripts from occupied territories, began to waver under the relentless pressure. By noon, the beachhead that had seemed doomed just hours earlier was finally secure. The cost had been enormous, over 2,000 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone, but the foothold in Europe had been established. The longest day was far from over, but the tide of battle was beginning to turn. While the drama unfolded on the beaches, another critical phase of Operation Overlord had begun 6 hours earlier. In the darkness before dawn, Major John Howard of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry led 6 horse gliders in a precision landing just yards from Pegasus Bridge, a vital crossing over the Caen Canal. The success of this mission would determine whether German armored reinforcements could reach the invasion beaches. At 16 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, Howard's glider crashed into a barbed wire fence less than 50 yards from the bridge. The silence that followed the splintering of wood and groaning of metal was broken only by the distant sound of Allied bombers passing overhead. Howard's men, trained to perfection for this moment, emerged from the wreckage with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Henry Brotheridge, just 28 years old and expecting his first child, led the charge across the narrow bridge. German sentries, caught completely off guard by the audacious glider assault, managed only a few wild shots before Brotheridge and his platoon overwhelmed their positions. In the brief firefight that followed, Brotheridge became the first Allied soldier to die on D-Day, falling just steps from the bridge he had helped capture. The success at Pegasus Bridge was replicated throughout the Cotentin Peninsula, as the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines. However, the airborne assault was plagued by problems from the start. High winds, enemy flak, and navigation errors scattered the paratroopers across the Norman countryside, far from their intended drop zones. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Cross of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself alone in a flooded field, surrounded by the sound of German voices. The 34-year-old career soldier had jumped into combat in Sicily and Italy, but this mission felt different. Everything depended on the airborne forces securing key roads and bridges before German reinforcements could counterattack the beach landings. According to military historian Max Hastings, in his acclaimed work Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, the scattered nature of the airborne drops actually worked to the Allies' advantage, creating confusion among German commanders who couldn't determine the main axis of attack. By dawn, small groups of American paratroopers were engaging German forces throughout the peninsula. Private First Class John Steele of the 82nd Airborne found his parachute caught on the church spire in St. Mire-Église, leaving him dangling helplessly as the battle raged below. German soldiers used him for target practice, wounding him in the foot, but miraculously he survived by playing dead for 2 hours until American forces secured the town. The most critical objective for the airborne forces was the town of St. Mire-Église itself, a vital crossroads that controlled German access to Utah Beach. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, despite breaking his ankle on landing, organized scattered paratroopers into an effective fighting force. By dawn, American flags were flying from the town hall, and German reinforcements found their path to the beaches blocked. Perhaps the most harrowing mission fell to the pathfinders of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. These elite soldiers, dropped hours before the main force, were tasked with marking landing zones and destroying key bridges. Technical Sergeant Elmer Crummell led a small team to the Lafayette Causeway, a narrow strip of elevated road crossing flooded marshland. The Germans had anticipated the importance of this position and fortified it heavily. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, and artillery was pre-registered on the causeway itself. Crummell's team faced the choice of storming across the exposed causeway or allowing German armor to use it to reach the beaches. The battle for Lafayette Causeway would rage for 3 days, with control of the narrow bridge changing hands multiple times. American paratroopers, often outnumbered and outgunned, held their positions through sheer determination. They knew that every hour they delayed German reinforcements increased the chances of success on the beaches. As the sun rose over Normandy, the airborne phase of Operation Overlord had achieved its primary objectives. Despite massive casualties and confusion, key bridges were secured. German communications were disrupted, and confusion reigned in enemy headquarters. The paratroopers, scattered across the countryside like seeds in the wind, had taken root in Norman soil and were preparing to hold their ground against whatever the Germans could throw at them. At the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler slept soundly, unaware that the fate of his 1,000-year Reich was being decided on the beaches of Normandy. His standing orders prohibited anyone from waking him before 10 o'clock in the morning, a luxury that would cost Germany precious hours. In mounting an effective response to the invasion, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group West, received the first reports of the landings at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris. The 70-year-old Prussian officer, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, immediately grasped the significance of the Allied assault. However, the complex command structure that Hitler had imposed on his forces in France would prove disastrous. Sly and ineffective in responding to the crisis, the German 7th Army, responsible for defending Normandy, was commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, a competent but unimaginative officer who had spent the war years in comfortable headquarters, far from the front lines. When reports began flooding in from coastal observation posts, Dahlmann initially dismissed them as diversionary raids, expecting the main assault to come at Pas de Calais, where German intelligence suggested it would occur. At Rommel's Army Group B headquarters, the absence of the Desert Fox himself created additional confusion. Rommel had traveled to Germany to meet with Hitler and celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that the weather would prevent any Allied landing attempt. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was left to coordinate the response, but without Rommel's authority, many critical decisions were delayed. The key to German defensive strategy lay in the Panzer Reserves, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler-Jugend stationed near Caen. These elite units, equipped with the latest Panther and Tiger tanks, could potentially smash through Allied beachheads if committed quickly and decisively. However, the division's commander, SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, awaited orders that would not come for crucial hours, as documented by German military historian Paul Karel. In his comprehensive study Invasion, Their Coming, the German response was hampered by Hitler's insistence on personal control over armored reserves, creating a paralysis of command that would prove fatal to the defense. At the coastal fortifications, individual German units fought with characteristic skill and determination. Despite being cut off from higher command, Major Werner Pluskett, artillery commander at Omaha Beach, had spotted the massive Allied fleet through his rangefinder at dawn. His frantic calls to headquarters were initially dismissed as hysteria, but as the morning progressed, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The German defenders at Point du Hoc, having discovered that their positions had been overrun by American Rangers, attempted a counterattack led by Sergeant Heinrich Severloh, known to his men as the Beast of Omaha. Severloh had been manning a machine gun position overlooking the beach since dawn, inflicting terrible casualties on the American forces below. His weapon had grown so hot from continuous firing that he had to pour water on the barrel to keep it functional. By midday, German resistance began to stiffen as scattered units reorganized, and local commanders took initiative despite the lack of clear orders from above. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit in immediate range of the beaches, finally received permission to counterattack. However, their advance was delayed by Allied air attacks and the confusion caused by widespread paratroop landings. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer's Reconnaissance Battalion, led a determined thrust toward Sword Beach in the early afternoon. His Panthers and Mark IV tanks encountered fierce resistance from British forces who had established strong defensive positions. The sound of tank tracks on cobblestones and the crash of high-velocity cannon fire echoed through Norman villages as the armored battle raged. The German counterattack came achingly close to success. Von Luck's spear had actually reached the coast between Juno and Sword Beaches, briefly splitting the British and Canadian forces. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the panzers might roll up the entire eastern flank of the invasion. However, without infantry support and facing mounting pressure from Allied reinforcements streaming ashore, the German advance faltered. As evening approached on June 6th, the reality of the situation became clear to German commanders at all levels. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Allied forces were consolidating their beachheads, and the promised rapid response by Panzer reserves had failed to materialize. The opportunity to drive the invaders back into the sea was slipping away with each passing hour. In his bunker deep beneath the earth, Hitler finally awoke to news that would shatter his dreams of an impregnable fortress Europe. The longest day was drawing to a close, but for Germany, the nightmare was just beginning. At the westernmost end of the invasion front, Utah Beach presented a stark contrast to the carnage unfolding at Omaha. Here, the 4th Infantry Division, under Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the 56-year-old son of the former president, was about to demonstrate that careful planning and inspired leadership could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Roosevelt, the oldest man to land on D-Day, had personally requested permission to accompany the first wave despite his age and failing health. His presence on the beach would prove instrumental in turning what could have been another disaster into the day's most successful landing. As his landing craft approached the Norman shore at 6:30 in the morning, Roosevelt gripped his walking stick and prepared to step into history. The naval bombardment preceding the Utah Beach landings had been far more effective than at Omaha. The battleship Nevada, veterans of Pearl Harbor, had methodically destroyed German strongpoints with her 14-inch guns. The result was a beachhead where German resistance, while determined, was not the overwhelming force that had nearly stopped the invasion elsewhere. However, the first wave of landing craft had drifted south of their intended target due to strong currents and poor visibility. Instead of landing at the designated Tarry Green sector, the 4th Infantry Division found itself on a stretch of beach a mile away from the planned assault area. This apparent mistake would prove to be a stroke of fortune, as the actual landing site was more lightly defended than the original target. Captain Leonard Schroeder of the 8th Infantry Regiment was among the first Americans to set foot on Utah Beach. Unlike his counterparts at Omaha, Schroeder found that he could advance inland without the withering fire that had pinned down other units. German resistance came primarily from scattered rifle pits and machine gun nests, rather than the concentrated firepower of prepared positions. As related in Gordon Harrison's official Army History cross-channel attack, Roosevelt's decision to proceed from the unplanned landing site, rather than attempt to reach the original objectives, proved crucial to the day's success. Roosevelt himself embodied the calm determination that would characterize the Utah Beach landings, walking among his men with his distinctive limp, pointing with his walking stick toward German positions. The general seemed oblivious to the enemy fire crackling around him. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared when informed of the navigation error, a decision that would be remembered as one of the finest examples of battlefield leadership. In American military history, the key to Utah Beach's success lay in the rapid establishment of exits from the beach itself. Unlike Omaha, where German defenders controlled the high ground and could observe every movement, Utah's terrain allowed American engineers to quickly clear paths through the dunes and establish supply routes inland. Technical Sergeant Curtis Cullen's team worked frantically to remove mines and obstacles, often crawling on their bellies to probe for explosives with bayonets. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the 4th Infantry Division had established a beachhead 3 miles wide and 1 mile deep. Casualties, while significant, were a fraction of those suffered at Omaha Beach. The success allowed follow-up waves to land with minimal opposition. Rapidly building combat strength ashore. The most dramatic moment came when elements of the 4th Infantry Division linked up with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, who had been fighting inland since before dawn. Colonel James Van Fleet's regiment, advancing through flooded marshland, encountered Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell's paratroopers near the village of Poopville. The meeting marked the first successful junction between seaborne and airborne forces, validating the complex D-Day plan. Private First Class Arthur Peterson, a 19-year-old from Minnesota, later described the emotional moment when he saw the distinctive airborne insignia on approaching soldiers. "We knew we weren't alone anymore," he recalled in post-war interviews. "Those paratroopers had been fighting for their lives all night, and when we linked up, you could see the relief in their eyes." The success at Utah Beach allowed American forces to begin the crucial task of expanding their foothold in Normandy. By evening, over 21,000 men and 1,700 vehicles had come ashore, establishing a secure base for future operations. The 4th Infantry Division had achieved its objectives with fewer than 300 casualties, a remarkable feat given the magnitude of the operation. As darkness fell over the Norman coast, Roosevelt and his men could take pride in a job well done. They had proven that the Atlantic Wall could be breached, that American soldiers could match the best the Wehrmacht could offer, and that careful planning combined with courageous leaders, Hip could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The success at Utah Beach provided the secure western flank that would be essential for the expansion of the Normandy beachhead in the days to come. On the eastern flank of the invasion, British and Canadian forces faced their own formidable challenges. As they stormed ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, the plan called for these Commonwealth forces to capture the city of Caen on D-Day itself, an objective that would prove far more difficult than Allied planners had anticipated. At Gold Beach, the 50th Northumbrian Division under Major General Douglas Graham approached the Norman shore with the methodical precision that characterized British military operations. The preliminary bombardment had been intense, with the cruiser Ajax leading a devastating barrage against German positions at La Hamel and La Riviere. However, German engineers had constructed a formidable defensive system that would test British resolve to its limits. Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards would emerge as the only man to win the Victoria Cross on D-Day itself. As his company approached a German pillbox that had survived the naval bombardment, Hollis single-handedly charged the position, tossing grenades through the firing slits and killing the occupants. His actions cleared the way for the advance inland, but the cost in British casualties was mounting steadily. The German 716th Infantry Division, responsible for defending this sector, had been dismissed by Allied intelligence as a second-rate unit composed largely of foreign volunteers. This assessment proved dangerously incorrect, as Polish, Russian, and Czech soldiers fighting for Germany demonstrated unexpected tenacity in defending their positions. Their resistance was motivated not by ideology, but by the certain knowledge that capture meant death as traitors to their homelands. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division faced perhaps the most challenging conditions of any Allied unit. The assault was delayed by 30 minutes due to rough seas, allowing the rising tide to cover many of the beach obstacles that engineers had planned to clear. Canadian soldiers found themselves wading through chest-deep water under heavy machine gun fire, their equipment waterlogged and many of their supporting tanks unable to reach the shore. As documented in Canadian military historian Terry Kopp's definitive work Fields of Fire, The Canadians in Normandy, the assault on Juno Beach demonstrated the exceptional training and motivation of Canadian forces. In their first major European operation since the WWII raid of 1942, Major Lockie Fulton of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles led his men across the exposed beach toward the heavily fortified village of Courseulles-sur-Mer. German positions in the seaside houses commanded excellent fields of fire across the beach, and Canadian casualties mounted rapidly. Fulton himself was wounded twice, but continued to direct his company's advance until a mortar shell ended his participation in the battle. The innovative use of specialized armor proved crucial to British and Canadian success. The 79th Armored Division, known as Hobart's Funnies after their eccentric commander Major General Percy Hobart, deployed Churchill tanks equipped with flails for clearing mines, flamethrowers for destroying bunkers, and bridges for crossing obstacles. These unusual weapons systems gave Commonwealth forces capabilities that their American allies lacked, contributing significantly to their rapid advance inland. Captain William Dunn of the Fort Garry Horse commanded a troop of Sherman tanks equipped with dual-drive propellers that allowed them to swim ashore directly from landing craft. This revolutionary technology enabled armor support to reach the beaches simultaneously with the infantry, providing immediate fire support against German strongpoints at Sword Beach. The British 3rd Infantry Division faced the additional challenge of defending against expected German armored counterattacks. Intelligence reports indicated that the 21st Panzer Division was positioned to strike the eastern flank of the invasion, potentially rolling up the entire beachhead. This threat necessitated rapid advance inland to establish defensive positions. Before German armor could intervene, Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade, including French commandos of the 4th Special Service Brigade, landed at Sword with the mission of linking up with airborne forces holding Pegasus Bridge. The commandos advanced rapidly through Wistreham, engaging German defenders in vicious house-to-house fighting. Their green berets became a symbol of British determination as they cleared the town street by street. By midday, British and Canadian forces had penetrated several miles inland, but the crucial objective of Caen remained tantalizingly out of reach. German resistance stiffened as the day progressed, and the expected rapid advance bogged down in the face of determined defense. The failure to capture Caen on D-Day would have profound implications for the subsequent Normandy campaign, but the Commonwealth forces had established secure beachheads that would serve as the foundation for eventual victory. As the sun set over the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the magnitude of what had been accomplished began to emerge from the chaos and carnage of the longest day. Operation Overlord had succeeded, but at a cost that would be measured not just in casualties, but in the transformation of a generation and the reshaping of the world order. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, established his headquarters in a farmhouse overlooking Omaha Beach as darkness fell. The 51-year-old Missourian, known to his men as the Soldier's General, surveyed reports from his division commanders with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The beachhead was secure, but the price had been higher than anyone had dared to calculate during the months of planning. Casualty figures remained uncertain in the confusion of battle, but early estimates suggested that over 10,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or were missing. The 29th Infantry Division alone had suffered over 2,000 casualties, with some companies reduced to less than half their original strength. These were not mere statistics, but fathers, sons, and brothers whose sacrifice had purchased a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. At Point du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder gathered the survivors of his Ranger Battalion round a shell crater that served as their command post. Of the 225 Rangers who had scaled the cliffs at dawn, only 42 remained unwounded and capable of fighting, yet their mission had been accomplished, and the German artillery that might have devastated the invasion fleet lay silent. The human cost extended beyond the beaches to the occupied villages of Normandy, where French civilians paid their own price for liberation. In Saint-Mère-Église, bodies of German soldiers and American paratroopers lay intermingled in the streets, while terrified families huddled in cellars waiting for the battle to pass. The liberation they had prayed for during 4 years of occupation had arrived with fire and steel. Dr. Eugene Landon, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, worked through the night treating wounded from both sides in a makeshift aid station established in a bombed church near Courseulles-sur-Mer. His hands, stained with the blood of young men from dozens of nations, embodied the universal nature of sacrifice that had characterized the day. German prisoners, some no older than 17, lay beside American GIs, their uniforms different but their wounds equally real. The strategic implications of D-Day's success extended far beyond the Norman coast. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received word of the landing's success with characteristic emotion, weeping openly as he addressed the House of Commons. The second front that Stalin had demanded for years had finally been opened, relieving pressure on the Soviet Union and ensuring Germany's eventual defeat. At his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler raged at subordinates who had failed to repel the invasion. His dreams of an impregnable Atlantic wall lay in ruins, and his closest advisors began to privately question whether the war could still be won. The Führer's refusal to acknowledge reality would lead to increasingly desperate measures in the months ahead, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. As referenced in historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis D-Day, June 6, 1944, the success of Operation Overlord marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, though 11 months of bitter fighting remained before final victory. For the survivors on the beaches, the immediate concern was not grand strategy, but simple survival. Supply ships arrived throughout the night, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements to units that had been decimated in the day's fighting. Engineers worked frantically to clear paths through the beach obstacles, while medical personnel struggled to treat the wounded with limited resources. The psychological impact of D-Day's success cannot be overstated. For occupied Europe, the landing represented the first tangible sign that liberation was possible. Resistance movements across the continent took heart from the news, increasing their activities and tying down German forces needed elsewhere. For Germany's allies, particularly those seeking a way out of the war, the invasion marked the beginning of the end of their association with the Reich. As dawn broke on June 7, 1944, the beaches that had witnessed such carnage began the transformation into bustling supply depots. The Mulberry Harbors, artificial ports towed across the English Channel, would soon begin operations, allowing the massive buildup necessary for the breakout from Normandy. The longest day had ended, but the campaign it began would continue until German surrender in May of 1945. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond military history. It represents the triumph of democratic values over totalitarian oppression, the power of international cooperation in the face of global threats, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary individuals faced with extraordinary circumstances. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, who jumped into the darkness over occupied France, who sailed across the treacherous English Channel, had written a chapter in human history that would inspire generations to come. Today, the beaches of Normandy serve as hallowed ground, visited by millions who come to pay their respects to those who gave their lives for freedom. The American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, contains the graves of over 9,000 American servicemen who died in the Normandy campaign. Each white cross and Star of David represents not just a life lost, but a future stolen, dreams unfulfilled, families forever changed. The story of D-Day is ultimately a story about the best and worst of human nature. It reveals the capacity for evil that allowed the Holocaust and the Nazi conquest of Europe, but it also demonstrates the extraordinary courage and sacrifice that ordinary people are capable of when freedom itself hangs in the balance. The veterans of Normandy, now in their final years, carry with them memories of friends lost and battles won, of a time when the fate of civilization rested in their young hands. As we remember D-Day, we honor not just the dead, but the living, not just the famous generals, but the unknown soldiers, not just the military achievement, but the moral victory it represented. The invasion of Normandy proved that democracy could fight and win against totalitarianism, that free peoples could unite against oppression, and that the arc of history, though long, bends toward justice in a world still struggling with the forces of authoritarianism and extremism. The lessons of D-Day remain as relevant today as they were on that longest day in June 1944.